And there we go. So go ahead and take it away.
Okay, got it. So can you hear me all right?
Yeah, you're great.
All right. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Pleasure to be here at the Illinois Ornithological Society Zoom to talk with you about my favorite subject, bird migration. Of course, for me, it's not like Groundhog Day because I've been giving some form of this presentation off and on for the past 49 years in hundreds of venues to thousands of people from Burma to Paraguay to Saudi Arabia and points in between. And as in the instructive groundhog fable, each time I find myself before a new audience, I'm forced to admit that nothing much has changed. Understanding of migration by most of humanity remains what it has been for the last few thousand years. That is caused by weather. Homer used a migration metaphor in describing a Trojan attack on the Greeks at their encampment, where he says, like cranes in clamorous lines before the face of heaven, beating away from winter's gloom and storms over the streams of ocean, hoarsely calling us. It's a great scene. Obviously, this is a poetic way of saying that migration is about weather. Well, so what? That's how they thought migration worked 3,000 years ago. Surely our comprehension has increased since then. But the truth is not so much. Consensus on the topic has not changed since Ulysses was battling the Cyclops and dallying with Calypso. So far as the majority of professional ornithologists and the public at large are concerned, migration is about weather. David Attenborough says so, and other ideas are fake news. But this understanding is completely wrong. It's as wrong as the belief that the sun revolves around the earth, which the majority of the world's population still believes, by the way, including a quarter of the people in this country. Tonight, however, you will hear the truth. Migration is not about weather. It's about food and sex, and it originates as a form of dispersal. Excuse me. That is movement by individuals, usually young, forced to leave home by parents and neighbors in search of a seasonally suitable place to live and breed. Now, I know you won't believe this, but in any event, over the next half hour or so, I will do my best to give you the main facts on which this particular truth is based. Like most everybody else, the perspective from which I began my journey was that provided by the Northern Home Theory, which holds that migratory birds originated on their breeding grounds as resident, non-migratory, sedentary members of these communities. Climate change in these northern places, occurring over millions of years, favored evolution of the characteristics that enable birds to leave for more equable climes when the weather is bad and return months later when it has ameliorated. When I began my migration studies in the 70s, ecological thinking and theorizing on the topic were dominated by Princeton professor Robert MacArthur, a fact which was as true of bird migration theory as of many other areas of ecology. MacArthur's migration paradigm states that migrants are temperate zone birds forced south by inclement weather into warmer areas for the duration of the winter season, where they subsist in marginal environments by harvesting superabundant food resources that resident bird species cannot exploit due to the restricted nature of these foods in space or time. Migrants then return to the breeding ground once the weather has gotten better. Well, MacArthur had made some observations himself, and many others Around that period of time, we're beginning to take a closer look at migrants in the tropics, but nevertheless, most of those observations were ad hoc. That is, they weren't down there really to look at migrants. They were there to look at tropical birds. And when they did see migrants, most of them wintering in Mexico, Central America, and South America, they found them in marginal environments, second growth, fallow croplands, pastures, parks, residential areas, towns and cities. Nevertheless, strictly speaking, this northern home idea of bird migration is not MacArthur's paradigm. He didn't originate the theory. It's been around, as we said, for hundreds or actually thousands of years. But MacArthur's contributions were critical. In typical fashion, he made logical, testable predictions regarding aspects of migrant biology that followed naturally from the central assumption of a breeding ground origin. Among these predictions were the following. The true niche for a migrant, that is the ecological space, including food and habitat, unique for its species, exists only on its breeding grounds. Once the migrant leaves its breeding grounds, it is outside its niche, which means that it must survive as a wanderer or fugitive species. Habitats in areas outside the breeding grounds will be occupied by indigenous resident birds. And in these environments, species similar to the migrants will exist as ecological counterparts, where they will fill the niches comparable to those filled by the migrants on their breeding grounds. Ecological counterparts prevent migrants from settling for long periods, that is weeks or months, in stable environments, either directly by chasing and fighting them, or indirectly by outcompeting them for food. Therefore, migrants exploit mainly marginal environments, which is where people often see them. Overgrown fields, brushy areas, during their wanderings in the non-breeding period. They're searching for patches of temporarily superabundant food that resident species are unable to harvest completely. Entry by migrants into more stable environments in the subtropics or tropics will occur only in situations where resources like fruiting trees or army ant swarms are temporarily so abundant that it cannot be harvested completely by or defended by resident ecological counterparts. So this sets up a dilemma for the migrant. MacArthur's predictions make clear that they're confronting the problems confronting a temperate zone migrant. The entire suite of structural, physiological, and behavioral adaptations for this bird supposedly evolved millions of years ago, according to northern home theorists, when its high latitude homeland was more climatically benign throughout the year. Now these adaptations are no longer suitable for survival during northern winters. Thus, each fall, the migrant niche, its ecological space, unique to each species, disappears for months at a time. And the bird is forced into more southerly regions where all the niches are presumably filled by a resident community of birds. That's where migration theory stood when I began my research on the topic back in the 70s. And it's pretty much where migration theory stands today, with a few fancy twists added by molecular geneticists. I got a grant from the Welder Wildlife Foundation in Texas to study long-distance songbird migration on breeding ground in Itasca in northern Minnesota, during migration as transients at the Welder Wildlife Refuge in South Texas, it's close to Corpus Christi, and on the wintering ground in southern Veracruz, rainforest. Thanks to MacArthur's formulation of how the northern home theory of migration should work in practice, I had a set of testable questions to address by working with actual migrants in the field. So in August of 1973, my little family and I, my wife, 2 children, daughter Brigitta was 6 at the time, and son Jay was 3, set off for the wilds of Texas and Mexico to test the northern home thing. Spent 2 years traveling to Texas for the fall migration, then to Mexico for the wintering period, then back to Texas for spring migration for the breeding period. Family helped out. There's my son Jay showing his priorities, making observations on a passing flight of brown pelicans. What we discovered during those 2 years of research with migrants was that the northern home theory just did not fit the facts. We worked with a lot of migrant species, but I will select one to illustrate what we found, the principal findings: the hooded warbler. Hooded warbler breeds across much of eastern North America. Winters in southern Mexico, down through Central America and parts of the Caribbean. Now, you'll recall from earlier that the northern home theory states that migrants are wanderers in winter. They have to be, because they evolved as residents in northern regions. They don't have niches in the tropics. But somebody forgot to explain this to our hooded warblers in southern Veracruz. These birds arrived in our tropical rainforest site, which is shown here, in October, set up small individual territories in the forest understory, male and female separately, defended these territories from other hooded warblers, and stayed on them throughout the entire winter season until leaving in April. We knew this because we captured and color banded the birds and watched them throughout their time at our sites. We also mapped their territories and found that of 10 birds with territories on our rainforest study area, 6 returned to the exact same territory they had left the previous year when we had checked them during the 74-75 season. And the hooded is just an example. We had individuals of 20 migrant species wintering in Veracruz lowland rainforest, all of whom showed fidelity to a particular spot in that forest all winter long. No ecological counterparts kicked them out. They lived like natives in the most complex and stable land environment the tropics has to offer, lowland rainforest. But how could this be? How could these birds violate all of the predictions of the northern home theory? Well, sorry to say, because the theory is wrong. By the time we completed our field work in the spring of 75, I knew the northern home theory simply did not explain the ways in which migrants actually lived. I spent the next year writing my thesis, in which I summarized the data collected, analyzed what they meant in the context of existing ideas on migrant ecology and evolution, and developed a new theory to explain how migrants might have originated in the tropics. I was very excited about the work, submitted an article putting forward my revelations to the journal Science. The reviewers thought the article was okay, but the editor rejected it, explaining that the subject matter just wasn't important enough for one of the world's leading scientific publications. Since then, I've published more than 100 articles and several books on the topic, but the impact of the data presented in those has had a little effect, I think, on my field. But if science is based on facts, how can this be? I used to think it was because the senior leading people in migration studies had staked their reputations on supporting the northern home theory, were just defending their position. So all I had to do was wait until a younger, more informed generation had replaced them. Now, half a century on, I find that I was wrong. The northern home theory of migration as a result of weather continues to reign. Why? Well, here's some ideas. Back in 2007, coming on toward retirement, I decided that I would write a book addressing and evaluating all major ideas in the field of migratory birds. I convinced Columbia University Press to publish it, and in 2013, The Avian Migrant came out. Among several ideas presented in that volume was a detailed investigation of the northern home theory, explaining why the theory didn't have the explanatory power the person did. A year later, in August of 2014, I got emails from a couple of my colleagues telling me that I had better check out the new article on evolution of in the things of the National Academy of Sciences. This paper, entitled Temperate Long-Distance Seasonal Migration in New World Songbirds, Benjamin Winger and Associates, was indeed of interest and relevant to my own work, especially my recently published book. In their introduction, the authors note the dominant paradigm in the literature on the evolution of migration by Rappole and others has imagined these long distance migrations as evolving via shifts of the breeding range out of the tropics, driven by increased reproductive success and reduced competition in the temperate regions. I found this quote noteworthy on a couple of counts. First, the dispersal paradigm presented is dominant nowhere except perhaps around my own dinner table, and that would depend on who my guests were. Secondly, use of the word imagined to describe the basis for dispersal pretty remarkable, as though it were based on some sort of flights of fancy. Well, then they, excuse me, Winger and company go on to present their idea. They call it the migratory syndrome hypothesis for the evolution of migration. They say long distance migration primarily evolved through evolutionary shifts of geographic range south for the winter, which is no more than the northern home theory in genetic garb. Now, their theory is based on three main considerations. First, the current range of the species, that is the migratory species that are under consideration. Second, the evolutionary history of relationships between species based on DNA analysis. These, as phylogenetics, these cladistic trees that you've probably seen in a number of publications. And third, they assume that migration is a syndrome or bundle of characters, like fattening, navigation, homing, and that this bundle evolved over millions of years. And a really cool thing about this bundle is that it can be turned on and off when it's necessary. If you don't need it, you don't use it. If you do need it, then you turn it on. Well, needless to say, to have a theory that our theory was built carefully on thousands of hours of field work by myself and others, dismissed as imaginings, and to have it replaced by one based solely on DNA is difficult to accept. But this new theory has received immediate acceptance. It helps the fact that the fearless confidence of the phylogeneticists is certainly one reason. They present their thesis in the form of a geometric proof. If you accept the analysis, you have to accept the conclusions. But the analysis is based on hundreds of assumptions, which they don't bother to defend. To take the most egregious example, the assumption fundamental to their entire analysis is that a species range is genetically fixed and determined. But climate change has demonstrated quite clearly that this assumption is false. In fact, hundreds of species have shifted their ranges hundreds of miles in a matter of years as climate change caused shifts in distribution of food resources. An example, the green jay. This is a green jay's change in range over the last little over a century. In 1912, Strecker, in his Birds of Texas, said the range was limited basically to the Rio Grande Valley. 1974, when Oberholzer's volumes were published, they had the range up about to Corpus Christi. And in 2004, the checklist of the Birds of Texas had the range, and I'm talking about resident breeding range, all the way up to well north of San Antonio. So this is a matter of years over which this change has taken. These data demonstrate that a bird's range is fluid. It changes as quickly as food availability changes. It does not require millions, thousands, or even hundreds of years. Falsification of that assumption that the range is a genetic characteristic of a species destroys the basis for the theory. And that's not the only problematic assumption. There are a number of others. In any event, I think part of the reason for the success of Winger et al. Is that acceptance of my alternative theory, dispersal is the origin of migration, requires a thorough understanding of migrant ecology, life history, and so forth. It is based on that most difficult of concepts, the dispersal. Until quite recently, it was completely invisible. All you could see were its effects. Now with eBird, that has changed. Most of you are likely familiar with this extraordinary crowdsource for bird distribution data. But for those of you who are not, I will give a brief description. In 2010, a new interactive website was launched called eBird, where any volunteer could join the program and submit any bird observation made anywhere in the country, providing date, time, and locality. The site has taken off, and now there are tens of thousands of volunteers recording every sighting they consider significant every day. The result is astounding. The observations are posted as distribution points on maps for each species in real time. As a result, you can see the actual routes followed and timing along the passage for fall and spring migration, and you can see dispersal. Take a look at the great Kiskadee, a tropical species for the most part. The species was found, the black area shows the distribution as of around 1912 when Strecker did his work. And then this solid gray area here shows the current breeding distribution. And these dots, they represent the outliers. That's dispersal. Anyhow, given some time to digest the implications of the migratory syndrome victory, I decided that I might enter the lists in the evolution of migration wars one more time. But this new book would be different. I would try to explain why migration had to be the result of dispersal in the form of a narrative. Interested so that would be how migrant birds for any organism that can move. And of course, completely trashing the migratory way. And that's this book that stimulated this talk for tonight. So Homer, what we say in the book is that Homer's wrong, MacArthur's wrong, and the phylogeneticists are wrong. These birds aren't northern birds forced out of their temperate and boreal breeding habitats by weather. They're tropical and subtropical birds that go north to take advantage of the tremendous surge in food availability that takes place during northern summers in order to raise more young than they could if they stayed in the tropics. Food and sex, just like I said. Well, if that's true, you might say, then why don't we see populations of these birds that breed in the tropics? Well, that's a great question. In fact, half of the 330 species of long-distance migrants that breed in temperate and boreal North America do have breeding populations in the tropics. Give you some examples. Parula warbler and its tropical counterpart, tropical parula. Red-eyed vireo and its tropical counterpart, the vireo. Great cheek thrush, Bicknell's great cheek thrush and its Caribbean counterpart. Snow egret, and on and on and on. There's a lot of other lines of evidence presented in the book, and you'll need to check it out, explaining why migration is understood as a form of dispersal. One of the more interesting, I think, is that migration can appear and disappear in a matter of a few generations in a particular species. There are a number of examples of this. That the site one is the Bachman's sparrow. At the time of a European arrival, they were limited to the pine lands of the southeastern United States. But with clearing of forest in the 1800s, Bachman's sparrow developed a migratory population that bred as far north as Pennsylvania and Ohio by the early 1900s. They bred in scrubby, abandoned farmland and old fields, wintering back within the original southeastern range. And interesting too is that although this occurred over just a matter of a century or so, you could actually, taxonomists describe a subspecies that was a migratory subspecies for the Bachman sparrow that could be told from the southeastern resident birds based on plumage. They also found that for the migratory population of the loggerhead shrike, which developed about the same time period and was similarly now disappeared. Because these migratory populations of Bachman sparrow, loggerhead shrike, and others disappeared because of the replacement of scrub and old fields by forest. Another reason perhaps that people don't cotton to the dispersal theory is they don't believe it's very important. It's like the question of whether or not birds evolved from dinosaurs or some other early line of reptiles. I mean, it's an interesting question, but what difference does it make? But as explained in the book, this view of the inconsequence of how migration begins ignores the immense significance in understanding the ecology and evolution of birds and many other forms of life. Attributing migration to dispersal from a more stable environment to a less stable one, with food and mates available on only a temporary seasonal basis, requires a complete reversal of how migratory bird ecology and evolution are understood. The breeding ground is not where the migrant originated. It originated from the wintering ground in many cases. Migrant evolution, including niche structure, is not shaped primarily by the breeding ground. Instead, it is the wintering ground, where migrants normally confront the most intense competition, having left a place where food was superabundant. And hence the most important aspects of natural selection occur there on the wintering ground. Males do not control female behavior during the brief breeding season, regardless of what Conrad Lorenz and others say. In fact, the reverse is true, due to the fact that females regulate male access to successful reproduction. The migrant annual cycle contains at least 5 seasons: spring migration, breeding, post-breeding, fall migration, and winter, not 3. Each of these seasons has its own unique aspects and challenges that differ for the different age and sex groups, and indeed for each individual based on its own specific experiences, and so on. Oops. Oh boy, I messed that up here. Oh, down here. All right. So you must, let me see if I can get this back here. Let's see. Sorry, messed up. All right. So you must read the book to understand the profound implications of a wintering ground origin for migrants. One last thing I will point out is that a wintering ground origin likely means that migrants have little to worry about from global warming and climate change. Unless their wintering habitats disappear completely, they're likely to survive regardless of what happens to their breeding habitats. Global warming has happened at least 19 times in the past 2.5 million years, and most migrant species survived. So that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. I'll take any questions.
All right, thank you. We do have a couple questions that came through in the chat. So the first question's from John Leonard, and he was wondering, what are other assumptions of Winger et al., the phylogenetics paper, that do not hold up to scrutiny and support their northern home idea?
Oh boy, that's complex. It's interesting because the Winger paper, you gotta have to take a look at it. They use a very complex decision matrix. They call a domino decision matrix, and it's based on as I said, the current distribution of the species and its relationships to other species, their closest relationships. And using those, they assume, but what they set up, what they call rules. Well, the rules are actually assumptions, but they call them rules. And if you follow the rules, then you, in their analysis, then you come out with the correct answer. I don't think I can actually go through those rules. I'll tell you something about that paper. I wrote a rebuttal to the paper, and I sent it to some friends of mine, other migratory bird ornithologists, and asked them to review it. And I know exactly what happened. They looked at that and they said, "Oh my God, this is going to be terrible," because they're going to have to be able to read and understand Winger's paper, and then read and understand what I was criticizing in that paper. And it's complicated. So they just stuck it in a drawer someplace, and I never heard from them again. You know, it's just, you know. So what I did was I put the critique into the bird migration book. So rather than try and pull out those aspects, I'm going to have to ask you to read the book.
Okay.
Sorry.
Yeah. I have a couple questions too, but I want to make sure I get to everyone else's. So one other person here, we've got Jennifer asking, for newer birders, could you describe the most pressing factors that drive the food and sex part of influencing migration?
Yeah, I think I can. See that when dispersal occurs after the breeding season in most species of mobile organisms, that the adults that raise the young don't usually allow them to stick around. So the young leave, they disperse. Now, they can move a long way, a short way. Birds, of course, they have the ability to move a long way if there's food on the route. So if there's food, which is happening when they're going on northern migration to move out of a place, that's during spring. Food is increasing. There's more food available than the birds present can harvest. That allows the migration to proceed. And when they get up to a place like New York or other places where temperate region, that the birds that live there year round, they can't possibly eat all the food that's being produced at that time, because in fact, those areas are now like the tropics. They have the productivity of a tropical region for a very short period of months. So that allows the birds to move there. Now, if both members of both sex move there and they breed, they can produce more offspring than they could than their parents could have produced back in their original tropical environments. And that's been shown. And the number of papers have studied where they have tropical populations of a migrant species like rough-winged swallow, and you have temperate migratory populations. The migratory populations produce many more offspring than the tropical residents do. So that's the idea behind the food and the sex. The food is you have to have more. You have to have superabundant food. That for years now. Well, I think it's still believed by most people that the purpose of the territory, the singing male of territory, is to defend enough food for them to raise their offspring. Well, that's not true at all. There's way more food than they need for that purpose. What they're trying to do is to obtain a territory with enough good nesting sites and good food, so that when the female comes, she comes usually a week later, after he's been fighting to get this territory set up from the other males. Then she just walks on and selects territory available essentially by the male. And then when they raise their young, when they get to the point where they're feeding their young, they're completely ignoring territory boundaries. And when the young fledge, they split up the breed and they brood and they wander all over the place. They don't defend the territory at all, because there's way more food available than is necessary. So that's why I'm getting at that. A dispersing bird that can find a new area, seasonally abundant food, can produce more offspring than had they remained behind. That's pretty complex, and I apologize for kind of stumbling around, but these are complex issues. You got to read.
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny. One of my questions was, is another assumption or a bad assumption assuming that all migration originated the same way? So I feel like everyone's often trying to say it was north to south or south to north, and sort of in a way saying all migration originates the same way. Would it be true, or do you think it could be possible that some was north to south, some was south to north, some was just dispersal? Like, I mean, could it just be different for each species?
I think dispersal is at the root of all migration. Now, weather has an effect, obviously, but it's an immediate effect. And so, in other words, food, if food disappears, the birds got to go. That's all there is to it. Now, where do they go? Well, they're going to go back, presumably, to where they know there is food. So that's why they go back where they were. Now, so is it possible that these birds, that there some forms of migration evolve from being pushed south gradually? I still think dispersal is the best explanation. That's my belief.
Yeah,
I
and
think
then
I explained it pretty clearly in the book.
yeah, and then I had one other kind of follow up to that, because I guess the one, like, I was thinking of something that's like really ultra like specific and where they breed, like Kirtland's warbler, right? So I mean, if you're talking about evolution, which is generally millions of years, you know, obviously Kirtland's warbler couldn't have adapted, or they must have adapted quickly to the small jack pine area, because that whole area was under a glacier, you know, 20,000 years, like even, you know, less than that, I guess, 15,000 years ago.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess to me, like, I guess that kind of supports, or I guess I was thinking maybe that supports your hypothesis where they just came in. But now it's weird because it seems like they're so tied to a very specific habitat that they breed in. They're not very compromising in choosing new types of. So I don't know. It's like, it seems like a weird kind of, like, I guess to me, like a example of something that would only have had to have been able to decide on that habitat kind of after it became available, which would be shorter than evolutionary time.
Yeah. What exactly? I mean, the niche of the Kirtland's warbler is in the Bahamas. That's the niche. They are that's where they came from. And why do they use jack pine? Which, by the way, jack pine, if you look at jack pine distribution, it's huge. It's across,
Yeah.
it's across 1,000 miles. You know, so how did they end up in this particular spot in central Michigan? And why do they have all this trouble? Well, that's complex, but basically, I'm sticking to it. I think they're Bahama birds, and they capitalized on the fact that there was this jack pine habitat available. With nesting sites is important to them as well. You have to have specific kind of nesting material and nesting sites. That's what, you know, like Parula warbler, they have to have some kind of moss or something in order to build their fancy little nests, and that kind of restricts them where they can get that, they use it. So no, I think the Kirtland's warbler is still a good example of how migration develops very quickly from dispersal from the tropics.
Yeah, and it was interesting because so another person in the chat, Tamima, she was pointing out that with the piping plovers over the last few years, it seems like she was saying that it sounds like their behavior kind of supports what you're talking about too, where as soon as they're done breeding, they sort of take off the adults back to their wintering grounds, even though there would be plenty of food to support them hanging out up here. So once they're done breeding, they kind of take off.
That's true.
And go go right back to the exact same territories that they're in every year for their wintering grounds.
No, that's very true. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's correct.
Yeah. And then, so there's a couple more questions that have come across now too. So John was wondering how, like, first winter neotropical migrants find their way back to appropriate wintering habitats.
That's a good one. Yeah. Nobody knows. There's I think the most prominent hypothesis at this point that was developed by the Germans. at Rappole Labs, Max Planck Institute. And their idea was that these young birds, they've never been to the tropics before where they winter. These are black caps that they were working with. So they winter in Africa, Central Africa. They actually have different populations, from different parts of Africa, wintering different parts of Africa. But they came up with this brilliant hypothesis, really. And the idea was that the young birds inherited a genetic direction, but they inherited this direction genetically, and the time that they should move in this direction genetically. So they haven't been there before. They just head off in this direction, and they go that direction for a certain period of time, and that takes them to where they need to be. It's really a brilliant hypothesis, but it makes the facts don't line up at all. And the big mystery is, it looks as though something is passed. I don't know how, from the adults to the young. They know where to go to winter. They don't go with the adults. They follow different routes often than the adults, as a matter of fact, and they leave at different times. So, but it's a fact. I mean, it's just if you take we'll take the willow warbler, which has recently expanded its breeding range into North America. It's essentially a Eurasian species. Well, they all winter down in Central Africa. Well, how do these young birds know this wintering area is not very big, and they cross thousands and thousands of miles of Africa and Europe and ocean to get to this site? Well, how do they know how to get there? I don't know. How do monarchs know how to get there? It's a different generation that goes to the wintering area than what comes back up in the north, but they know, and there's a lot of data to show that they know. So it's a mystery. We don't have the solution, but it isn't the route and timing.
There must be like a bird map that they leave them that we just don't know. You know that.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. Yeah.
And then I know John had a couple of questions, but some other people had questions, so I'll come back. Bill had a good question. He was asking about, have the migration concepts you've been talking about been studied or considered for austral migrants or any of the old world migrants? Yeah.
Well, sure. Absolutely. Same thing. Although austral migrants are much more poorly studied, Asian migrants, there's almost no work. Almost all the work has been done by the Germans, the British, and the United States. And there has been work more recently done elsewhere. The Swedes are coming on strong and got some good stuff going, but there's almost nothing's been done in Asia by Asians, Japanese or Chinese or anything that they have no apparent interest in. But austral migration, you bet. They've just begun really looking at austral migration, but there's probably about 200 species of migrants that migrate south from the Amazon into southern South America. Then there's a whole slew of species that migrate up and down mountains, altitudinal migration, but it's the same principle. And there's huge numbers of migrants that move into the Himalayas and back and forth into southern India. So yes, but it's all the same principle as far as I'm concerned anyways.
So then, yeah, we have another question that just came in from Amy asking about, you were discussing climate change impacts, and she was wondering if there was a way to clarify, because she was thinking that, or what she's saying is that it seems that the southern wintering areas might be at higher risk from climate change, with some also seeing some big development, depending on politics and everything in some of those areas.
If those, I will say this, if that happens, if the wintering area disappears, they'll be gone. There's no question about that. I don't think that will happen. We've seen lots of habitats threatened, but if any of it remains, they'll probably stick around.
Mhm.
And the example comes from the phylogeneticists, the cladists. They say most of these songbird migrant species are 2.5 million years old. Well, if that's true, they've been through global warming plenty of times.
Mhm.
And they'll probably make it this time.
Yeah. And then another question John was asking, sort of a follow-up to the neotropical migrants, was, do studies of homing pigeons give us any clues about site fidelity among neotropical migrants? Are those related, like the mechanisms maybe?
What the mechanism for site fidelity is?
Yeah, like when they're studying homing pigeons, does that give us sort of a clue about what the mechanism would be for neotropical migrants for site fidelity?
Absolutely, it does. And yes, it's the same. This is the same thing, and that's the fascinating thing about this too, is that the migratory syndrome that they talk about, all these characteristics of homing and fattening and navigation. Well, resident birds possess those as well. Well, the homing pigeon is mostly resident, but it can home, it can fatten, it can navigate. So yes, that's absolutely true. That all of those studies of the homing pigeon told us a heck of a lot, and all the other various studies that have been done about the fascinating thing about these studies is what they show is that there's a lot more there's a lot more sensory material out there than what we recognize as humans. Ultraviolet light, polarized light, magnetic field, and on and on and on. Basically, anything they can use, they use, and not just birds, insects, lots of things that move can use these various things to aid in their movement. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I think that was all the questions that I saw in the chat. So, yeah, I'll give anyone one last second here if you want to throw something in the chat, another question. But this was fascinating. I feel like I don't know if I have more answers or more questions now after hearing you talk. So,
I'll read the book. You already read the books. All right.
Yeah, it'd be great. Yeah. So yeah, I don't see any more questions coming in. So I just want to thank you for presenting to us. Thank everyone for joining. And yeah, I'll definitely have to go out and get this and make this my next read. So
all right.
Thanks so much.
You're welcome.
All right. Thank you. I'm going to stop recording.